Hi, it's Dave here. It's Wednesday, June 4th, 2025. Today I'm going to talk about Alex O'Connor and why he seems to have lost his faith in atheism. I saw a video a while back, posted to YouTube in August 2024. It was on Chris Williamson's channel entitled Searching for God with Alex O'Connor. In that video, Chris asked Alex about how he deals with certain troubling aspects of being a long-lasting atheist, like Chris himself. And Alex responds to Chris, I don't know, but probably by being agnostic. So, Alex, the winsome atheist YouTuber extraordinaire, is a long-lasting atheist no longer. Okay then. Alex then remarked to Chris, as he often has, on how cringeworthy a lot of the lazy, clueless commentary dismissing religion and theism is. And he insists, I'm not that. And he evidently means, I was that, but I'm trying not to be anymore. He also tells Chris, there's room for doubt. So I don't want to exaggerate. I don't know much about the details of Alex's evolving views. But apparently Alex has changed his mind, at least from when in 2023 he posted a video entitled, This is Why I Don't Believe in God. That video, which will be the focus of my discussion here, has views well into the 7 figures, so pretty compelling stuff apparently. Check it out. In the present video, I'll discuss Alex's position in that 2023 video, and I'm going to explain why Alex has changed his mind since then, going from atheist in 2023 to agnostic by mid-2024. Or to put it another way, going from offering arguments that, according to the 2023 incarnation of Alex O'Connor, quote, should compel us to dismiss the hypothesis of a supernatural creator, end quote, to instead at least confessing there's room for doubt. So in the 2023 video I'll be focusing on here, Alex offers 3 arguments against the existence of God. They are the arguments from the hiddenness of God. Secondly, the arbitrariness and geographical distribution of global religions argument. And then the argument from gratuitous suffering. So you can see all the details in Alex's video. It seems to me each one of these 3 arguments against belief in God is easily answered. Not one of them is even close to compelling, as 2023 Alex claimed. In this video, I'm only going to discuss Alex's first argument from that video, which also seemed to be his favorite. For the record, I'll just note that I think the other 2 arguments could equally well serve my purpose of giving a probable explanation of why Alex has perhaps retreated from his former confident atheism. And that explanation is pretty straightforward, which is just this, that Alex has recognized that his favorite arguments for atheism are actually really terrible. And certainly they're nothing like compelling. So that's my thesis. Now let's get into a bit of analysis. So I think there are a number of ways of pretty accurately summarizing the real meat of Alex's divine hiddenness argument. My initial hot take reaction, which I posted in Alex's comment section when I watched his video, was this. I wrote, these are remarkably simplistic arguments for a guy who's read all he claims to have read. It's easy to read, I suppose, not so easy to understand what you read. In a nutshell, Alex's argument is, I tried to believe in God, but I couldn't believe. Therefore, I believe God doesn't exist. Right? Okay, well now, if that's a good argument, then so is this. I tried not to believe in God, but I couldn't not believe. Therefore, I believe God does exist. Right? So those are both silly arguments, regardless of the amount of sincere gravitas, pathos, bathos with which they might be presented. So that was the end of my comment there. Now, I still think this is an accurate summary of the real lack of substance underlying Alex's apparently much more interesting and serious argument. Now, I don't know if Alex read this comment. Maybe he did, and that's why he changed his mind, right? Unlikely, but possible. Anyway, here I'm going to flesh out a much more detailed analysis showing, I think, the justness of my original assessment of the argument. So here we go. In his video, Alex spells out an explicit logically formulated version of his position, which he borrows from a fancy Oxford-educated Canadian philosopher named J.L. Schellenberg. So I'll start with that. Here's the argument, and do watch Alex's video if you want to hear him elaborate on what he takes it to mean. So, premise 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. So, first conclusion, a perfectly loving God does not exist. And final conclusion, therefore there is no God. So, a bit of logical housekeeping. This is a straightforwardly valid argument in propositional logic, which is to say, by application of the standard rules of propositional logic, we can see that the conclusion follows from, or is entailed by, the premises. So, in standard form, it's easy to spell the argument out. I'll put that in the notes below here. You can see what it looks like. So for anyone familiar with propositional logic, clearly this argument is valid, and that just means that the premises entail the conclusion. In other words, if the three premises are true, then the conclusions in 4 and 5 must be true. And in that case, the argument would be not just logically valid, but actually sound, i.e. the kind of argument Alex would like it to be. And of course, we can also note the converse. If either of the conclusions in 4 or 5 is false, then the validity of the argument entails that at least one of the premises must be false. That's just how logic works. So Alex's job in advancing this argument is to show that the three premises are indeed true, thus entailing the truth of his atheistic conclusions. So how is that supposed to work? How does one show that one's premises are true? Let's review some general points about how arguments work, points which Alex seems to be not sufficiently aware of. So first off, before looking at how arguments work, maybe I should mention what arguments are. In other words, what do I mean by the term argument? So to be clear, in talking about how arguments work here, I'm talking about the logical structure and movement of arguments. Often when people think of arguments, especially people with no philosophical or scientific training, instead of something like logical analysis, they think of a quarrel, mere verbal sparring, something involving nastiness, ill will, a come now, let's not argue kind of thing. Or they think of argument merely as an apologetics exercise, trying to persuade non-believers to believe in God, for example, or to believe in atheism. I think that's where Alex is stuck. But again, here I'm not talking about arguments in the sense of a quarrel, or merely in the sense of trying to persuade others or to win converts to one's position. I'm talking about a philosophical analysis of arguments, an analysis of how arguments function as a tool for seeking to understand the truth and to acquire knowledge. So the most basic elements of an argument are the terms. For example, the term God, or perfectly loving, or non-resistant non-belief. Terms, in turn, make up the propositions. For example, the proposition God exists, or God is perfectly loving. And propositions are connected by inferences where we derive conclusion propositions from our premise propositions. So the most basic question in analyzing an argument is, do we understand the meaning of the terms making up the propositions in the argument? Now, if Alex's divine hiddenness argument is new to you, there's a good chance you might first up be wondering about what exactly is supposed to be meant by the term non-resistant non-belief, found in premise 2 and premise 3. Having a clear understanding of the crucial terms used in the premises of the argument is obviously a necessary prerequisite for evaluating whether the premises are actually true or not. Unfortunately, demonstrating an understanding of the terms he uses in his arguments seems not to be one of Alex's strengths. It seems he's so focused on trying to convince his audience, and perhaps himself, that his premises and conclusions are true. In other words, he's so focused on the apologetics task he has set himself that he tends to neglect the question about what his premises mean. This mode of proceeding would be fine if it were the case that the meaning of his premises is obvious, and part of Alex's argumentative sleight of hand is to proceed as if this meaning is obvious, which will naturally induce his perhaps naive audience to assume the same. But I think that would be a mistaken assumption. The meaning of his premises is not obvious. I'll be defending that claim in a bit, but first, one more general point about how arguments work. If we want to understand Alex's rhetorical strategy, I think it's useful to consider a distinction famously made by a guy named Aristotle between three kinds of argument: demonstrative, dialectical, and contentious. In a demonstrative argument, we know the premises are true. Either we can demonstrate they're true, or they're taken to be first principles. Such an argument is taken to prove the truth of its conclusion. In a dialectical argument, by contrast, we do not claim to know the premises are true, but the premises are the received opinion of all parties to the argument. So a dialectical argument shows what conclusions the parties to the argument should accept as a logical consequence of what they already believe. Finally, the third kind of argument Aristotle distinguishes, a contentious argument, proposes premises that are disputed. A contentious argument, then, shows only what would follow from the adoption of certain disputed premises, for the sake of argument, but omits addressing either the question about what the truth of the matter is, or even what we ought rationally to believe in light of our admittedly fallible, but at least shared opinions. Shared, that is, at least by everyone to whom the argument is addressed. In the practice of law, the term arguendo is used to indicate the use of this last kind of argument. So applied to Alex's argument, Alex claims his argument is compelling. I'd say it's clearly not, but in terms of the distinction between demonstrative, dialectical, and contentious arguments, he's apparently wants to claim his argument is either demonstrative and simply sound, or at least dialectically sound. That is, that his audience either explicitly does or implicitly, logically, should accept his premises, and thus, as a matter of logical consistency, should accept his conclusion. And by implication, then, he wants to claim also that his argument is not merely contentious, based on premises that his audience does not and has no logical reason to actually affirm. A central part of what I want to point out in this video is that Alex is clearly mistaken about that. His argument is, in fact, merely contentious, and quite obviously so. So, I'd say to begin with, there are two fatal flaws in Alex's argument. He fails to define the meaning of his terms, and he fails to see that his argument is merely contentious, given the reality of his dialectical context. Now let's get into some specifics of Alex's contentions, starting with the problem of what exactly he means by his terms and the premises he constructs from them. Now note that we need to first understand the meaning, and only then can we evaluate the true status of Alex's premises. We should notice that all three of his premises make substantive claims, which deserve substantive treatments in order to flesh out their meaning and in order to be rightly understood. And while Alex seems not to realize this, doing so is in fact essential to any kind of substantive logical analysis. The most obvious substantive point of critical inquiry, as I've already suggested, would seem to be the notion of non-resistant non-belief. Alex's argument crucially depends on premise 2, the claim that non-resistant non-belief does not, i.e. cannot, occur if a loving God exists, together with premise 3, the claim that non-resistant non-belief does indeed occur. But the pressing question then is, what is non-resistant non-belief supposed to mean? What exactly is it supposed to refer to? If we don't have an answer to that question, we can't very well intelligibly assert either that non-resistant non-belief actually does exist, as in premise 3, or that it's incompatible with the existence of a loving God, as in premise 2. In his video, Alex dwells at length on making the case that he is himself a case of non-resistant non-belief in order to prove premise 3, but he neglects the more important, and more importantly, the logically prior question, what is non-resistant non-belief? So what is it? The idea is apparently the following. Non-resistant non-belief, where the non-believer in God does not believe, but also does not resist belief in God, contrasts with resistant non-belief, where the non-believer does resist believing. And the apparent assumption, to spell out premise 2 more fully, is that if a perfectly loving God exists, then on the one hand, any and all non-belief must be resistant non-belief. And it's also rather wildly assumed the occurrence of this kind of non-belief, which is to say resistant non-belief, would not be problematic in the context of Alex's other premises. Like that's highly questionable. Anyway, and on the other hand, it's assumed that given a loving God, no instance of non-belief could be non-resistant. So why? Well, apparently because non-belief in the resistant case would be intelligible as permitted by God, and as due to the resistance of the non-believer, whereas in the non-resistant case, non-belief would be unintelligible and impossible. Why? Because a perfectly loving and just God, presumably, would not and could not permit such non-resistant non-belief to occur. That's pretty clearly Alex's underlying rationalization. The problem for Alex, however, is that such a rationalization is not just false, but obviously false. Now, if that's correct, as I claim it is, then you might wonder, well, then why doesn't everybody notice that? Why are people apparently so impressed by this argument, if it can be so easily and obviously refuted? I think that's a question worth taking seriously, so here's my theory. I think this is actually a clearly stupid argument, to be bluntly honest, right? But the interesting thing that we need to consider then is what happens, rhetorically speaking, when people listen to an argument like this, especially when it's presented in a particular kind of formal setting, as this argument is. What they think, I think, is something like this. Well, this Alex chap speaks well, and he seems to be well educated. It appears he's thought long and hard about this, and he's got other people on his side saying the same thing, who likewise seem like they're probably well-spoken, well-versed in logic, well-educated, professionally credentialed. I suppose there must be something to what he's saying, you know. He might be wrong, of course, but even if he is, clearly it must be a very tricky business to see through what his error might be. Or maybe the thought is to the effect, well, this guy, he seems like he must be some kind of expert, right? And experts don't go around saying stuff that's obviously wrong, so it can't be the case that what this guy is saying is obviously wrong, right? So I think, and this is interesting and worth paying attention to, that given the rhetorical dynamics in play, this kind of reaction is going to be quite normal for an ordinary, open-minded, average intelligence listener. And nonetheless, the argument, considered in itself, setting aside the seductive rhetorical context, is in fact an obviously easily refuted one. Any ordinary, open-minded, average intelligent person should actually be able to look at premise 2 and notice, wait a second, that premise is either obviously false or at best contentious, you know, obviously disputable. So clearly this is not a compelling argument. Now, to be fair, most people don't have much in the way of precise analytical vocabulary at their disposal, so they might not put it that way. But I think most people, including Alex O'Connor, are smart enough to be able to look at the argument and say quite correctly, that second premise, I don't think so. Right? So for those who disagree with this claim, I will come back to this point. But for now, I'll point out that even if Alex would disagree and seek to defend premise 2, he does not do so in his video. And my suspicion is that's because it never even occurred to him to consider the possibility that premise 2 was in fact obviously false, or at best highly dubious. Which again, if true, is extremely interesting. How do you just fail to consider something so essential to your argument and so obvious? In any case, I think it is obvious. Although, of course, obviousness is relative to the eye of the beholder, or more precisely to the state of knowledge of the beholder. And so it follows that Alex's argument is easily rebutted and refuted. The easiest rebuttal of Alex's argument, then, is just to point out that his premise 2 is obviously false, so his conclusions don't follow. So to remind you, premise 2 claims that if a perfectly loving God exists, then non-resistant non-belief does not occur. A perfectly reasonable rebuttal, then, would be to simply point out that this is an absurd claim. It's entirely contrived. There's no reason to believe it. But suppose we granted Alex premise 2. Even then, it would be most reasonable to think that the truth of premise 2 would imply the falsity of premise 3. How so? Well, if we accept the claim that non-resistant non-belief does not occur if a perfectly loving God exists, then it's perfectly reasonable to assume that, nonetheless, a perfectly loving God may well exist, and in this case it simply follows that non-resistant non-belief indeed does not occur. In other words, it is not at all obvious, given the merely logically valid argument sketched out by Alex, that the ill-defined thing referred to as non-resistant non-belief is indeed a real something that really does occur. On the contrary, it could well be the case that any allegedly relevant case of non-resistant non-belief in fact necessarily does involve some kind of at least covert resistance, so that it's not non-resistant non-belief. Again, Alex does not even attempt to demonstrate that this is not the case. So more on this below. So again, it appears, strange to say, that it never seriously occurred to him that it might not be the case, that his and Schellenberg's premise 3 might be simply false. Okay, and thirdly and finally, I would argue that even if we granted Alex premise 2 and premise 3, then it would be most reasonable to think that premise 1 would be false. How so this time? If we grant that the existence of a so-called perfectly loving God would be incompatible with the occurrence of non-resistant non-belief, and that non-resistant non-belief does occur, then we must grant that a perfectly loving God does not exist. But we still perfectly reasonably deny the conclusion there is no God follows, because we can reasonably claim that premise 1 may well be false. That claim would seem incredible to Alex, no doubt. I'm sure he would object, how can you just give up on the claim that God is necessarily perfectly loving? Isn't that supposed to be one of God's essential defining attributes? Well, yes, it is. But the answer to the objection is again quite easy. By the classical and orthodox Christian understanding, God is indeed perfectly loving, but by the classical and orthodox Christian understanding, God is certainly not perfectly loving in a way that would entail the impossibility of non-resistant non-belief in him. Obviously. Right? So premise 1 then, if we were to grant premise 2 and premise 3, would obviously be based on an equivocation on the meaning of perfectly loving. And because of this equivocation, we could quite reasonably dismiss premise 1 as false, given the contrived and equivocal sense of perfectly loving that Alex introduces there. In other words, the meaning Alex gives to perfectly loving is a question-begging distortion of what any theist means by perfectly loving. Naturally, Alex again does not address this obvious problem with his argument. So to me, it seems that the logical case against Alex's argument is pretty cut and dry. It could only convince someone who assumed that Alex's premises must be true, or at least probably true, because Alex speaks as if he knows what he's talking about. But anyone who actually thinks about the premises themselves should be able to see that there is, in fact, no reason to think they're all true in the sense required for the argument, and especially that premise 2, by any standard definition of terms, would appear to be clearly false. In other words, Alex pretty clearly and quite literally doesn't know what he's talking about. Still, I suppose some people might actually look at premise 2 and think it plausible. Such people might object that I've just poo-pooed Alex's premise 2, and not actually shown that it is purely contrived and obviously false. For the benefit of such people, let's try to get a little deeper into the analytical weeds. Let's try to actually think this through, so we can see a bit more clearly that thinking it through seems to be something that Alex did not do. So premise 2 asserts that if a perfectly loving God exists, then non-resistant non-belief does not exist. Why? Presumably because a perfectly loving God could not permit non-resistant non-belief. The idea apparently being that unless you are resistant, why would God, or how could God, deny you the gift of believing in him? To do so just wouldn't be loving. That's the claim. But there's a problem here. If Alex's perfectly loving God would not willingly permit non-resistant non-belief, why does Alex suppose that he would willingly permit any non-belief whatsoever, whether non-resistant or resistant? Why, Alex, would God choose to punish resistance rather than lovingly overcome that resistance? In light of Alex's simplistic notion of perfectly loving, which he wants to foist upon God and us, it would appear that a perfectly loving God simply couldn't choose the punishment option over the loving persuasion alternative. What would be loving about that choice? But this being the case, it seems that instead of premise 2, Alex should have had a different premise 2. Call it premise 2 star, Namely, if a perfectly loving God does exist, then there should not occur any kind of non-belief in God. And conversely, applying the rule of contraposition, if any non-belief in God does occur, then a perfectly loving God, i.e. God, does not exist. So, in short, not believing in God proves that God doesn't exist, as I pointed out in my initial comment on Alex's video. Like, wow, who'd have thunk it was that easy to justify belief in atheism? I don't believe in God, therefore God doesn't exist. But then the question is, what was the point anyway of introducing the notion of non-resistant in contrast to resistant non-belief? Was there any logical, metaphysical, moral reason for making that distinction and contriving to introduce it into the argument, as if it were somehow essential and relevant, when it appears not to be? I'm not sure. I can't speak for Schellenberg or O'Connor, but as far as I can see, the only purpose served by the resistant versus non-resistant distinction is to muddy the water. It makes a simple, obviously silly argument into a more complicated, silly argument, the silliness of which has been disguised or obscured by the introduction of the irrelevant complications.